This is part of the catastrophe of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, is that our people and our struggle has been consistently represented by a leadership that is far more reactionary than the people, right? This again takes us back to Ghassan Kanafani and Saad, of like, no, the compass is the people. The compass is the people in the refugee camps and in the villages and in the crafts shops and whatnot, right? It's the teachers and the farmers and so on. They're at the front lines of this. They don't need to read a book about the history of Palestine. Their family is the history of Palestine. And again, 70% of us are refugees. So for 70% of us, for the majority of us, Palestine as a struggle is a struggle to return. What does it say that our liberation organization's official line since the 70s has been that we're willing to turn our backs on the refugees and the struggle for return? Our liberation movement is a movement for return of refugees. That's the fundamental pillar.
Ghassan Kanafani, writer, journalist, and thinker, is one of the most prominent voices in Palestinian history. Forced to flee with his family during the Nakba of 1948, Kanafani carried that rupture into every aspect of his life, politics, and purpose. He became a novelist, journalist, and revolutionary thinker, giving voice to the Palestinian struggle in ways that were both literary and profoundly political. His novellas, like Men in the Sun and All That's Left to You, grappled with the human cost of displacement, exile, and occupation. His political essays and journalism were equally incisive. On Zionist literature, exposed how novels, plays, and essays, what we might today call the mainstream media, functioned as ideological tools to justify colonization. While the revolution of 936 to 939 in Palestine analyzed uprisings, colonial oppression, and the challenges of organizing for liberation. But Kanafani was more than a chronicler of struggle. He was a participant. As a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, he worked at the intersection of literature, art, and politics, producing work inseparable from the fight for justice. Now, just as Palestinian journalists are being murdered today, over 250 have been killed since the genocide began. Kanafani, too, was assassinated by Israel in 1972. He was just 36. To help unpack this immense legacy, I'm joined by Hazem Jamjoum, a Palestinian historian, translator, and educator based in London. Hazem's work focuses on preserving Arab history and memory and tracing how cultural production shapes political life. In 2023, his translation of Kanafani's The Revolution of 936 to 939 in Palestine was published by 1804 Press and won the Palestine Book Award. In 2024, he released his first literary translation, Maya Abu al-Hayat's No One Knows Their Blood Type. Hazem's work connects historical texts and revolutionary thought to the present, showing us not only how figures like Kanafani shaped their time, but how their words still speak directly to ours. Hazem, welcome.
Thank you.
You know, we've all been watching this genocide play out over the past 2 years, and we are all concerned, and naturally so, about what is happening. We know what is happening now, right? And for some, it may be a little bit odd to be talking about a writer from the past, from 50 years ago. Who was Kanafani, and why does he matter today?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. Ghassan Kanafani was, like you said, a kind of revolutionary intellectual who grew up a refugee and became a student activist in Damascus until he was expelled from university. Was recruited into the movement of Arab nationalists, Harakat al-Qawmiyin al-Arab, which later kind of developed into several popular fronts, including the Popular Front for the Liberation of Oman and the Arabian Gulf and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. He was a member of the political bureau of the PFLP and the editor of its main magazine. And I think one of the things that's often forgotten about Ghassan Kanafani is that one of his greatest contributions was as an editor. He's often remembered as a novelist for good reason. He's often remembered for some of the interviews he gave as a spokesperson. But it's really his role as an editor that brought him in touch with the other revolutionary intellectuals and journalists relating to Palestine, but globally. And so it's this very particular moment in the 1960s and 70s where you have global revolutionary movements that are really talking to one another and really beginning to try to kind of find the commonalities and differences and ways of building alliances. And so Kanafani becomes a very important connection as an intellectual, as a journalist, as a writer, as a representative. And so is someone who's constantly in these spaces with revolutionaries who are Tamil, who are from Nicaragua, who are Kurdish, who are Japanese, who are from all over the world, and plays this role of, I want to say, translator or bridge. It's not necessarily a translation from one language to another. It's a translator of between one context and another, between one generation and another. In a lot of ways, when we read Kanafani today, he's a bridge for us between that period of the 1930s and 40s to that period of the 1960s and 70s to today. And I think and he's extremely incisive. Right? So he's able to see, we see this through his writing, he's able to understand what kind of constellation of forces we're up against. And one of the things that's very particularly, what's very particular about him is that he's very honest, in the sense that he's not writing as a propagandist. He's not writing, and let me kind of really go into detail about what I mean here. Generally, revolutionary intellectuals, part of what their role is seen to be is the mobilization of the largest swath of the population, convincing the largest swath of the population to join revolutionary activity. And oftentimes what a revolutionary intellectual will interpret that to mean for their role is to effectively be a propagandist, right? To say that, all other options but the revolution are terrible, and to effectively romanticize revolutionary activity, and make it seem as if it were this kind of, rose petal laden path to this kind of utopic future that will be paradise on earth somehow, right? And Kanafani does not do that. So if we think about his novels, this is something that a revolutionary intellectual of our current day, Khalid Audatullah in Palestine, has really highlighted, is if we look at his novels, none of the novels paint a picture that is comfortable or rose petal laden, right? So if we think of Men in the Sun, the option of seeking personal salvation by finding work in the Gulf and whatnot, you end up being baked in the desert and in a water tank, right? Driven by a leadership that is just simply unable, is completely impotent to lead. With ما تبقى لكم, with what remains to you, all that remains to you, you have the kind of impossibility of being this refugee in Gaza. With you've been expelled, your mom is in one place, your father's passed away, he's ordered you not to get married until Palestine is reclaimed. Your sister marries a collaborator and a traitor. Your journey to go and be reunited with your mother so you can join the revolution takes you through the Naqab desert, where an Israeli soldier hinders your path, and where the only kind of the closest we come to an happy ending is that the sister, that the collaborator must die and that the sister must abort the fetus that is the product of her union with this collaborator. With the return to Haifa, we are posed with this idea of the child, this Palestinian child who's raised by an Israeli family, and we encounter him in his Israeli military uniform. And with Saad, we contend with the impossible position of the mother who has to think and reckon with the fact that her son wants to join the revolution, and this is a path that probably leads to his death, but where him not joining the revolution is one of living in shame and weakness, right? So he's not there trying to paint any kind of rosy pictures. There's no Palestine utopia. in Kanafani. There's no post-liberation, we're all going to be rich and comfortable and have everything that we want. And there's no romanticization of the past either, right? So when we read a book like the Revolution of 1936 to 1939 in Palestine, the kind of backdrop essays about the labor movement, the peasantry, and the intellectuals is an impossible situation, right? It's a situation of British occupation, of deep inequities, of Palestinian society that is deeply divided along class lines, with a feudal and clerical leadership, propertied leadership that is racing to sell out the rest of the population at the lowest cost, right? And so he sees clearly. He sees clearly, and he conveys what he sees clearly without mincing his words, without trying to sugarcoat anything. And I think this is where a lot of the importance of his work lies in terms of reading it in the present.
When you think about the kaleidoscope that he offers of the Palestinian experience, so how does it fit into your interests or your pursuits as an intellectual, as a reader, as a Palestinian yourself? So, meaning, what drew you to his work?
Well, I mean, to be very frank, it's the hype, right? So Kanafani is a household name for Palestinians. He's considered an icon of the revolutionary moment of the 1960s and 70s. And so, as a young person who was getting radicalized and politicized, I'm reading C.L.R. James, and I'm reading Audre Lorde, and I'm reading these kind of revolutionary activities from all these other contexts and wondering, where are ours, right? And so Kanafani is in the kind of leads the list in a way of people that one reads that come from this kind of Arabic language writing and reading tradition, who are the revolutionary Arab writers and thinkers who've left their thoughts to us in written form that we can access, and so he becomes one of the key people that one reads. But then what keeps you in is that radical honesty, but also it's not a party line, right? So he doesn't barter in bravado. This isn't about sloganeering at you, and insofar as there are Kanafani slogans, they are slogans that reach quite deep. So if we think about, for instance, the slogan of El Hadaf, which was the PFLP magazine, which Kanafani was the senior editor for, it was كل الحقيقة للجماهير, all the truth, effectively all the truth and nothing but the truth to the masses. And
it's kind of like Malcolm X's statement also, I'll get the truth from wherever it comes from.
That's about getting the truth, for sure. But in terms of the role of the revolutionary leadership as being completely and 100% honest and transparent with the masses, this actually, to my mind, flies in the face of a lot of the kind of more vanguardist revolutionary leadership thought, which is that, if we think of Lenin saying that the vanguard needs to be 10 steps ahead of the masses, if you think about the general, even kind of popular idea about what a revolutionary leadership does, which is that it kind of trades and barters in secrets, right? That it somehow has a certain knowledge, is generally kind of has a deeper analysis than everybody else, is privy to information that it then decides whether it's going to share or not share and how it's going to share.
Yeah, so Kanafani respects the people.
So, I mean, Saad, the novel he writes near the end of his life, is really actually this, and you almost wonder, was this surprising, or are you just trying to convey something you already felt and believed? But Saad is a real character. She's a woman that he pays to, she's paid by people around the neighborhood to clean houses and stairwells and whatnot, right? So, and so she's someone that he's encountered as his employee, as somebody that he hires for her kind of service labor. And so as he talks to her, as she ponders and agonizes around the fate of her son joining the revolution, he's discovering that with all of his reading and all of his, even after all the conversations with all these revolutionary intellectuals from all of the world, that Saad is one of the greatest teachers he's ever had. Right, and so it's it's this thing about, it's not just about like respecting the people. It's about recognizing that, when we talk about revolutionary leadership, it's always voiced as being in the service of the masses, and yet will often be this extremely elitist approach to the mass of the population as people who are ignorant, who don't know, can be led to astray, right? And here we have Kanafani saying, no, the people are our greatest teachers. We treat ourselves as somehow more knowledgeable or more insightful, or we see more clearly than them, to our own detriment. Yeah. Or another kind of very famous Kanafani quote is one of the most important, in this moment, one of the most important things to my mind, and that whenever I'm speaking with people, I really try to emphasize, is that line about imperialism is this monster, this beast that has laid its body all over the globe, with its head in the west and its body over the east and its tail and so on. But that when you strike a blow against any part of it, you strike a blow for the world. You strike a blow for everyone. And I think that's never been as clear as it is right now, with the way that the Israeli state is so obviously only able to exist from day one until today, for 78 years, due to an exceptional level of international state support and corporate support, of just being floated with billions and billions of dollars annually from the very first day and until today. That effectively a view of the world that sees, the United States and Britain and Germany and Australia and Israel as somehow separate entities that maybe kind of come to the aid of one another because they see themselves as civilizationally connected, or because of lobbies or whatnot. This really misses the point. They see themselves as one. Right? They see themselves not only as one, they see themselves as a very fragile one, a house of cards, right? And a feeling that they see that Israel is a card that if pulled out, if allowed to fall, everything in the rest of the edifice becomes at risk of crumbling. And so how else do we explain over $45 billion worth of aid? This is the formal aid and support, most of it, the immense majority of it, military, given just by the United States to the genocidal state of Israel. How do we explain that? The United States is floundering. They're cutting, then slashing budgets left, right, and center. Trump on day one comes in and just scraps all of USAID, for instance, and scraps everything that he sees as something that is dispensable within the budget. And yet, will still double down on billions and billions of dollars being sent to Israel. This man who is all about kind of cutting the deficit and whatnot is willing to give billions to a genocide. How else do we explain it? Right? How else do we explain the British state just in the last month or two announcing that it's going to pay Israel $2 billion to come and to hire the Israeli military forces to come and train its own? Right? This is in the middle of a genocide. So Kanafani is, again, it's not just a bravado of internationalism. It's a deep understanding of internationalism. It's a deep understanding that our enemies see themselves as, are actually far more internationalist than us.
Where does he manage to gain all of these different skills? Right, he's a refugee pushed into Syria, then into Lebanon. Right, he becomes an editor, he becomes an artist, he becomes a writer. But he's not just a writer; he's actively part of this idea of the struggle.
This is somebody who is deeply involved, right? So he's sort of encounters George Habash, leading figure in the movement of Arab nationalists, and then the kind of general secretary of the PFLP, as a student activist. And it's Habash who says, come help out with editing Al-Ra'i, which was the kind of periodical or the organ of the movement of Arab nationalists at the time. He is a teacher at the UNRWA school in the camp, in Yarmouk camp in Damascus. And then he's an editor in Kuwait. One of his biggest mentors is his older sister, Faiza, who's completely written out of his story. She's the one who hooks him up with that job in Kuwait and is the mother of Lamis, who is the kind of beloved niece that is killed when Kanafani is assassinated by the Mossad in 1972.
In the car bomb.
In the car bomb in Hazmiya, but I think this is maybe something that anybody who's involved or has been involved in political organizing of this kind probably shares this experience. You learn the most from other revolutionaries, right? From older people, from younger people, from listening and keeping your eyes and ears open. So again, Kanafani is encountering all these people through his work as an editor, through his work as a political organizer, through the fact that he's a teacher in the camp and meeting these. He's learning from the people all the time, right? One thing that maybe people know his novels, but they don't know his short stories. His short stories are very autobiographical. I mean, I don't know this for certain, but when you read them, they're unmistakably autobiographical. And they're stories of a teacher in the refugee school camp, and someone who is seeing his student kind of secretly working shining shoes on the street corner, and you can see him using these short stories. And this is before we have Kanafani, the revolutionary intellectual. This is Kanafani trying to process his reality using short stories as a form. You see him learning from the people around him, from from his own students, from the camp barber, but then he's also encountering these revolutionaries from Cuba and Nicaragua and Tamil and South Africa and Kurdistan and so on, and so I imagine a lot of the learning is happening from his peers, from other revolutionary journalists and intellectuals and fighters and leaders, from people like George Habash and Wadi Haddad, who are in his very intimate political circle, from watching other Palestinian and Arab political leaders in action at the various conferences and congresses and secret meetings and public meetings. From the fact that his office is almost a community center where everybody is coming by to talk about what's going on.
He also travels widely.
He travels widely.
He goes
maybe
to China.
Not as well. I mean, that's one very particular trip where he goes to this kind of international convention of journalists and writers, where he manages to go to China, India, and Thailand, and you can see, but this is also late in life. This is, I think, the mid-60s where he does this trip and writes a little travelogue of it. And he's meeting very high-ranking officials and seeing, the effects of. What does it look like post-revolution in China? What does it look like after Nehru in India? What does it look like? And so obviously there's learning there. He's also an avid reader. I mean, this is kind of insane. So I was speaking to the translators of On Zionist literature, and while they were translating it to English, they were having a really difficult time with the reference material, with the footnotes, because the footnotes in the Arabic published copy don't really correspond to where those quotes are in the originals. And so they wondered, is this him being sloppy? What's going on? So as they tried to investigate why are these footnotes so all over the place, they realized that a lot of the books that he's reading, he doesn't have access to in Lebanon. And so it's on the trips with his wife to Denmark, these texts that his wife's comrades in Denmark have managed to kind of get a hold of for him at his request. He's reading them and then just kind of remembering roughly where he was on the page or in the book, this probably was about a third of the way in. It's probably around page 74. But he's not sitting at something like a major research library where he can just call up books willy-nilly as he pleases. He can't go on to some piracy website and get all of the PDFs that he wants. So, but he's voraciously reading, right? And one thing that I think is worth noting about Kanafani is that he, quite young, I think in his early 20s, gets diagnosed with a very serious terminal illness. And so from what some of his comrades have told me, he lived his life with a feeling that he's going to die any day. And so that he's in a race against time constantly. And I think that maybe also helps why he's so prolific, but also intent and intense with the way that he's handling. There's no luxury both in terms of his own lifetime, but also in terms of the urgency of liberation. There's no luxury of like, let me take my time with this, let it sit with me, I'll come back to this later. Now or never.
Let's talk about the 1936 to 39 revolution, right? This is the book that you translated for 1804 Books. For our viewers, what was the context in Palestine during the early 1930s, especially around 1936 when this revolution begins? Help us understand the moment, and why does Kanafani see it as foundational?
First of all, Kanafani's book on the revolution of 1936 to 1939 in Palestine remains one of the best histories we have of the 1936 revolution. Despite it being so slender of a volume, it's written as an extended essay for an incredible Palestinian periodical called Shu'un Falastiniya, Palestinian Affairs, which was edited by Anis Sayegh, and it's possibly like one of the great published achievements of the Palestinian revolutionary movement in the 1960s and 70s. And Kanafani was very intimately involved in that magazine until his assassination. So basically what I'm going to say about that revolution is what I've learned from him, from this book. So one thing we need to understand is that Palestine comes under British military occupation right after World War I. And the British come to occupy Palestine with a commitment to the Zionist movement, which is encapsulated in the Balfour Declaration, but is, to the point where the British go to the League of Nations and say, our mandate over Palestine is going to be guided by the Balfour Declaration. So they make it official on an international level that they are going to come into Palestine and they're going to engineer all of their policies and practices in Palestine towards transforming this place into a Jewish homeland, right? And so what they do, and the person that they choose as the very first kind of High Commissioner, Herbert Samuel, is somebody who's just come out of a very big political scandal here in Britain called the Marconi scandal, and is one of the leading Zionists in the British establishment. Right, he's one of the most Zionist Brits at the time, basically. Right, and let's remember that this is a moment where there was only one Jewish member of the British cabinet, Lord Montagu, who was the most anti-Zionist member of the British establishment at the time, right? The only Jewish member of the British cabinet is the one person who writes a very powerful condemnation of the Balfour Declaration, saying that if this is the logic that we're going to use, then I, as a Jewish British person, you're basically telling me I have no place, there's no place for me in Britain, that the only rightful place for me is to move out, leave my Britishness entirely alone, and that the only place I can be Jewish is to go to Palestine as a Zionist, and I completely refuse this. So the British come into Palestine and they begin to immediately enact a series of policies and practices aimed to completely immiserate the Palestinian agricultural workers and working class, to kind of keep the Palestinian elite sweet, but without giving them any kind of additional authority, and to really gear everything towards what would be called the Jewish sector at the time, right? So this burgeoning Zionist movement, creating a kind of policy atmosphere that allows Jewish business to thrive. And when we say Jewish in this context, it's really where we also mean Zionist. But in the documents, it's all referred to as the Arab sector, Jewish sector, right? And so by the time we hit the late 1920s, it's a really dire situation for Palestinian workers and for Palestinian agriculturalists. And now the Zionist movement is using the British police to confiscate land, to clamp down on protest, and so on. But the really major turning point comes in 1932. Right, with the election of the National Socialists, the Nazi Party in Germany, because it goes from the context of a deep-seated social anti-Semitism that's also part of government policy and law into a genocidal kind of set of policies and kind of political trajectory, right? It becomes patently unsafe at a mortal level to be Jewish in Germany, and by extension Austria and so on. And so you have this major drive of Jewish families to try to seek safety somewhere else. And of course, the vast majority of Jewish people trying to leave Germany are trying to go where all refugees try to go: Britain, the United States, Canada, and so on. And the way that all of these countries respond is by closing their borders to Jewish refugees specifically, right? A peak anti-Semitic, like in the moment of the Nazi ascension of power, countries like Britain and Canada and the United States say no Jews is still too many Jews, right? Just a very clear anti-Semitic set of policies that are enacted. Culminating in 1938 with the Congress of Evian, where all of these states get together, kind of the US and Britain shepherd an international conference that's ostensibly about rescuing Jewish refugees, but is in fact a way where each country says, we'll take 15 Jewish families. Right? Because that's how great we are. We want to save these people. But it's effectively about saying we won't take the other 5 million families. And we'll just, that's where we're going to cap it, right? And so you have this, if we look at the British census in the late 1920s, there's no more than 60 to 80,000 Jewish people that the Zionist movement has been able to bring to Palestine. It's a complete failure. But the Zionist movement set out to create an exclusively Jewish state in Palestine, right? The idea of a land without a people for a people without a land was not a statement of fact. It was a statement of dream. It was a statement of this is what we want to. It's a projection.
Yeah,
exactly. And so, but you hit the late 1920s, and this is after 30 years of the Zionist movement investing millions of pounds and dollars into trying to move white Jewish people to Palestine. I mean, able-bodied, young Zionist Jewish people, to be sure. But the investment is immense, right? And to fund as much as possible the acquisition of land in and around Palestine. And it's a dismal failure. They've managed to acquire almost none of the land, and they've only managed to move 80,000 people to a country with a population around 1 million. So it's a drop in the bucket on both levels. So it's a failure, right? But the Nazi Party's victory in the elections in Germany changes that. And it changes that because now not only is there this mortal risk of remaining in Germany as a Jewish person, the places you want to go have all said you're not allowed in.
Yeah.
You're not the right kind of person. And so one of your only options is Palestine. And not only is there's also something called the Jewish Agency that all you have to do is go to them and say, I want to move to Palestine, and they'll facilitate that process for you. It's their main raison d'etre, is to move white Jewish Zionists to Palestine, able-bodied, young, once again. And so you have this spike in Jewish migration, right? And so that creates an immense tension, right? You have Palestinians who are having their land taken away from them by the British authorities, are facing a crushing amount of taxation, are facing the Histadrut's efforts to Judaize labor, which is to kind of make sure that any new job created is one that's going to go to a Jewish person, a Jewish immigrant. And so you have this kind of impoverishment and immiseration. You have a complete kind of military policing by a military occupation of the most powerful imperial power on the globe, the British Empire. And so you must find a way to fight this, right? And so you have the beginning of a kind of militant cell organizing by a Syrian revolutionary preacher called Izzeddin al-Qassam, who has fled the French repression of the Syrian uprisings of the 1920s and has set himself up in Haifa, and is now kind of taking the lessons of the resistance in Syria and elsewhere, and trying to apply it into these secret militant cells all over Palestine. You have other forms of organizing that are taking place. You also have an elite form of organizing taking place by the feudal clerical elite that are trying to do these kind of pan-Islamic congresses and trying to sort of shore up some sort of elite solidarity with similar kind of feudal clerical leaderships in Muslim places like India and like for the rest of the Arab world and so on. Quite pathetic in a lot of ways, and definitely not geared towards the betterment of the majority of the population, but about ensuring that their elite status remains intact, right? And so by 1935, 1936, this really sort of reaches the kind of crescendo where, at least in the urban settings, there's a call for a general strike. Right, and so this is sustained, one of the longest and most sustained general strikes in human history. Probably it lasts 6 whole months, and it only comes to an end because those feudal clerical elites from around, right? So these other puppet monarchies that the imperial powers have set up in the other Arab states or states in the making, together with the pressure by the British themselves, kind of force this elite to say, okay, we're calling off the strike. And so that impulse to fight this immiseration moves to the countryside, and where those kind of militant cells become the nucleus for an armed insurrection that grows into a rebellion, that grows into an uprising, that grows into a revolutionary movement, and is a social revolution as well as a political revolutionary movement. So that's, and of course the British come in with full force, right? So the crushing of what becomes known as the Great Arab Revolt, what Kanafani calls it Thawrat al-36 because that's what Palestinians call it also. So the way that we refer to that moment is the revolution of 1936. And the way that they crush it, actually, they develop their pacification doctrine in that revolution, right? So they're borrowing from how they've crushed other insurrections and revolutionary moments elsewhere, like in India and elsewhere, and Ireland. And I mean that adds a whole set of units to the counterinsurrection textbook. Yeah. That's then applied in places like Kenya against the Mau Mau uprising, against Ireland, and so on.
And at the time, there's all these independence movements that are also arising, right? In all of these places.
Of course.
So these pacification techniques are certainly like borrowed and sort of like transplanted into all of these other contexts.
And the other kind of important aspect of this is that it also becomes the playbook by which the British military is training the nucleus of what would become the Israeli military, right? The Haganah. And so you have someone like Ord Wingate being brought in and he's just one of many, he's just the most famous of them. And Ord Wingate, his uncle is Reginald Wingate, the king of Egypt and the Sudan in the First World War. When we talk about the Wafd Party, the Egyptian delegation that was banned from going to Versailles, it was Reginald Wingate who banned them. Right? This is the man who ruled Sudan with an iron fist as effectively a monarch. He wasn't on the rotation of governors general and viceroys. He was in situ for a very, very long time. So Ord Wingate comes in and effectively trains people like Moshe Dayan, who would become the general of the Israeli military, and many, many others, on things like collective punishment. How do you displace the entirety of a village? How do you ensure the maximum pain caused to the villagers as a form of punishing them for producing a resistance fighter, or for saying no to a land confiscation, or saying no to an order of a military order, right? So that's that moment. The moment that Kanafani is writing this book, this extended essay, is the early 1970s. So most people are familiar with the crushing defeat of the Arab armies in the 1967 war. And of course that did cause a lot of sadness and depression all over the global south, as well as, of course, the Arab world in general. But this is the 1967 defeat is followed almost immediately by the victory at the Battle of Karame in March 1968, in which Palestinian commandos, backed by a renegade artillery unit of the Jordanian military, push back an Israeli invasion that was supposed to destroy this Palestinian training camp near the village of Al-Karame, which also incidentally translates as dignity in Arabic, so the battle for dignity.
And there was like an upsurge in the amount of people wanting to join the resistance movement.
I mean, that's the understatement of the century.
Yeah.
Basically, every Palestinian in the world wants to join the revolution after Karame. That's seen as the path now, right? And so, and that armed struggle can, in fact, do something. The Israelis are not invincible. This is the first time that, on record, that the Israeli military is defeated and pushed back and does not accomplish its military objectives from the moment it's established. And so people are flocking to the offices of Fatah and the Popular Front and whatnot, mostly in the refugee camps and mostly in Jordan. And I know people who were studying in France or the United States and said like they dropped out of everything and moved to Jordan for this, right? And so there's this period from 68 to 1970 where Jordan becomes, the global epicenter of revolutionary meeting.
Yeah, this hub.
It's the hub. This is where Jean Genet writes The Prisoner of Love, remembering this. This is where, and if you read Prisoner of Love, which I recommend everybody read because it's an incredible text, but we're not just encountering Palestinian fighters, we're encountering the Sudanese officer who's come to give his knowledge and experience to the fighters, so there's people from all over. And in 1970, the Jordanian regime, backed by the Americans and the Israelis and the British and whatnot, decides to go on the offensive and to wipe out this revolutionary moment, and to do it with the full force and violence at its disposal. Right? This is, we're talking about mass graves littering the Jordanian geography that are not talked about, and we're probably in the next decade or two we'll be in a situation where nobody even remembers where they are, right? And where there's also very little interest in talking about what happened in 1970 and 1971 for a variety of reasons. And so it's really this defeat. It's really 1970 and 1971, because what happens in 1970 is Yasser Arafat comes to an agreement with the Jordanian monarchy to withdraw what remains of his fighting forces into the woodlands near Jarash in the north of Jordan. And so in 1971, they're really kind of easy pickings in a way for the Jordanian Air Force and the Jordanian military to come in and slaughter what remains. And so this is really what's the backdrop to the writing of this text. And by the way, it's particularly notable because Kanafani is not known as a historian, right? So if we look at his long-form writing, other than the novels and the short stories, it's books like on Zionist literature. It's books like on Palestinian resistance literature. It's the kinds of works that we would consider cultural studies, culture critique. It's a very materialist analysis of culture, and probably a trailblazing materialist analysis of culture. Not probably, it is a trailblazing analysis of materialist analysis of culture. But history will come into his political analysis and his writing, but to take on a particular historical moment and say, I'm going to be the historian of this moment, that's not all throughout his life. That's nothing. We've seen nothing like that from Kanafani. But in this moment, which is the low point, right, at the very, very lowest that Kanafani has ever seen the Palestinian movement since 1948, right? He's never seen a worse situation that the Palestinian resistance movement has been in. He decides to write a history book. Right? This is and the way that he starts this book kind of tells us why he wrote it, right? Because he effectively opens the book by saying that in 1936, the Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movement faced the constellation of forces that has been the same constellation of forces of the enemy that has been arrayed against us since that moment, right? So he's saying this is really an originary moment. It's not an original, a kind of starting point for Palestinians or a starting point for the resistance movement or a starting point for any of these other things. It's a starting moment for when we have this particular triumvirate, this particular trio of this nexus of three things arrayed against us.
So it's like the British, the Zionists.
No, they're set in order.
Okay.
And the order is very important,
Yeah.
because the first thing that he mentions is the reactionary Palestinian leadership. The second thing he mentions is the reactionary Arab leadership. And the third thing is the alliance between Zionism and imperialism. And that's very, very important, right? Because really this book is not a book about British crimes and about the crimes of Zionism. And about those are just assumed. Those are our enemy. We know they're our enemy. We can analyze them. It's important for us to understand them. But there's no question of where we stand vis-a-vis them. It's the reactionary Arab regimes, but primarily the reactionary Palestinian leadership that needs to come under analysis. And really what he's saying is that there is this what it means to be a reactionary Palestinian leadership, we can understand and we can historicize from that moment. That's really what 1936 is an original moment for, is an understanding of the dynamics of what it means to be the reactionary Palestinian leadership. And here he's really quite fixated on Haj Amin al-Husseini, the mufti that the British installed as the mufti of Jerusalem, who then the British themselves forced to become a resistance figure by not giving him any scraps from their table, who then goes and becomes a Nazi. Right? So this is the mufti that when Netanyahu gets up a few years ago and says that the Holocaust was a Palestinian's idea, of course that's nonsense, but we're talking about this extremely evil kind of character of the mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini. But Kanafani is really trying to kind of detail this reactionary Palestinian leadership. And so when I put out the translation with 1804 books of this essay, this book, I followed it up with a translation of an essay he wrote in Al-Hadaf, also around the same time. And I think that these need to be read together. And that essay is called The Spectre of the Palestinian State. And in that essay, he effectively says something which for me was really, really important to kind of hear, which is that we as Palestinians never had statehood as the end goal of our revolution. That was never what we were calling for, right? Then, and once you hear that, it all starts to make sense in a way, because the primary manifestation, the primary way that imperialism and colonialism has kind of materialized itself in our region is through those borders. Right, that border between Palestine and Jordan, that border between Palestine and Lebanon, that border between Syria and Lebanon, that border between Iraq and Jordan. Those borders are the that cutting up of the region, and then parceling it out to different reactionary families. You know, mostly the Hashemites actually in the Eastern Med, but also to the kind of Muhammad Ali dynasty in Egypt, and the attempt to give it to the Hashemites in Iraq, and the attempt to give it to the Hashemites in Syria, and so on. That's the primary manifestation of imperialism in our region. That's how they've kept us under control, right? By parceling us out and then handing us over to these reactionary dictatorships. And then whenever you get a revolutionary leadership, to make sure that they also become a reactionary dictatorship, like the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, like the Ba'ath Party in Syria, and so on. And so So he says, you know, we're hearing for the first time in 1970 this idea of Palestinian statehood as if it's the end goal of our struggle, which it has never been. We're hearing it from the right wing of the liberation movement, right? He doesn't say Arafat's name, but he's very much talking about Fatah and Arafat. And what this statehood means is the complete liquidation and elimination of the Palestinian Revolution and the Palestinian resistance movement, right? This thing that would later become known as the negotiated settlement, the two-state solution, manifested and kind of materialized in the Oslo agreements and the Palestinian Authority. He prophesizes all of this in this article. Effectively, he says what this is going to be is a way to ensure that Zionism can last well into the future by carving out in the language of what we would now use, thanks to South Africa, Bantustan, right? Kind of a South African-style homeland, where you can plant the Palestinian flag and you can have a person who is of a Palestinian family pretend to be a president and play head of state. We can have a Palestinian police force and a Palestinian jail and a Palestinian courtroom, all to imprison our population. Either to imprison them within the ghetto or to imprison them within the prison if they say no to the ghetto. And so basically this statehood that's being talked about is effectively the surrender of our revolutionary movement.
Yeah.
Right? As soon as he hears the word statehood, he immediately clocks. He immediately recognizes what it is. This is 24 years before the Oslo agreements. Yeah. He predicts the Oslo agreements, right? And this isn't a moment where you have even like any clear sign of who these Palestinians would be who would come in to be the Bantustan administrators. But it is clear, he's also been in meetings with the right wing of the Palestinian Liberation Movement, Fatah and so on, for years at this point. So maybe he also has a sense that he wouldn't put it past them to see themselves as victorious, where they get to play president and get to sit in the VIP lounge at the Schiphol airport in Amsterdam and to drive around in limousines and have the red carpet rolled out with a Palestinian anthem blared out from a military brass band in the US, right? And lo and behold, he's assassinated right in the wake of this. And by the way, I actually think that Kanafani's assassination, we think of Israel now as this like extremely murderous regime. It's always been a murderous regime. But assassinations carried out outside of Palestine is not a major part of the Israeli modus operandi. It's not something that the Israelis had been doing very much before the assassination of Ghassan Kanafani, if at all. Right? We've retroactively fitted Kanafani into a series of assassinations carried out in Europe and whatnot, which are the Munich, like post-Munich Olympics. Munich Olympics happen after the Kanafani assassination.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Kanafani is really an exceptional... the assassination of Kanafani is very, very exceptional when it happens. They would later carry out many, many more. My sense, actually, is that it was because he was sounding the alarm bells about statehood. That basically there is this understanding by the Americans, by the Israelis, that this option of a kind of Palestinian agreement on becoming a Bantustan administrator is an option that needs to be kept viable as a backup plan at the time. And that if you start to have people with the kind of clear-sightedness of a Kanafani, right from the beginning, sounding the alarm, saying, hey, no, this is about the return of the refugees, the return of the land, and a situation where all the people in that land can live with dignity. Otherwise, it's not my revolution. Right? If you have that line starting to grow and be developed, that's a really, really big danger to us, right? And so that's the context. That's the context. This book, my reading of the book, and it's one reading of many possible readings, but my reading of this book is a book that's about a critique of the leadership of the PLO, where what Kanafani's aim is that people will understand the parallels between a Haj Amin al-Husseini and a Yasser Arafat, will understand that a class reading, a materialist history of the 1936 revolution can then be applied to look at also the 1948 Nakba and to look at all subsequent moments to understand that the reactionary leadership is going to constantly be looking for that scrap from the table that will allow them to maintain their privilege, right? And history has proven him right, consistently, right? Kanafani is assassinated in 1972. In 1974, Arafat convenes a meeting of the Palestinian National Council in Rabat, in 1974, that's correct. A Palestinian National Council meeting in Rabat where he alters the liberation program to be one that will accept statehood on any part of Palestine that is liberated. He's immediately then invited to the Arab League meeting, in which the PLO is declared the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. This is within months, And there's no coincidence that these all happen one another. They're all conditioned on one another. So basically, that the Arab League will recognize the PLO as sole legitimate representative is conditioned and premised on the acceptance of an idea of partition of Palestine, right? Which is also non-threatening to the Arab states. Remember that Palestine is the cause that all Arab leaders will pay lip service to, but none will actually support unless it's in the version that is acceptable to them, right? Because if you have a revolutionary Palestinian situation, that threatens to create a revolutionary situation in a place called Egypt, in a place called Jordan, in a place called Saudi Arabia, Morocco, etc. And then as soon as the Arab League adopts this resolution declaring the PLO the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, the PLO gets invited to the United Nations. And that's where Arafat gives his famous gun on the olive branch speech, where he's accepted as an observer state. I think the same status as like the Vatican, it's a non-state that gets to come and watch. And that's declared a massive victory. Right.
There's this clip from around 1970 where he talks to this Australian journalist, I think, in which he slams the Arab leadership. He slams the complicity of Saudi, Morocco, Tunisia, and he calls Egypt and Syria this petty military bourgeoisie.
We consider the Arab governments two kinds. Something we call reactionaries, who are completely connected with imperialists, like King Hussein government, like Saudi Arabian government, like Moroccan government, Tunisian government. And then we had some other Arab governments which we call the military petit bourgeoisie governments. That's like Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Algeria, so on.
So he kind of draws this line, as you were saying, between sort of the complacency or the complicity of the leaders in the 1930s and sort of the complicity of the leaders during the 60s as well. Now, are we able to use his analysis to understand sort of like the behavior of the Arab states today?
The kind of the structural position in which those states find themselves in and those regimes find themselves in is generally the same. The major difference, of course, is that the Cold War context created this Soviet backing and a kind of a space, that enables something like the non-aligned movement for these recently decolonized states to not be completely under the Washington and New York's thumb, right? To have some room for maneuver. And in some cases, plenty of room for maneuver if they're going to operate as a Soviet satellite, but then you have somebody else's thumb that you're sitting under, which is Moscow, right? And let's remember that the Soviet Union was the very first state in the world to recognize Israel, right? And that position, that Soviet positioning vis-a-vis Israel, it never really turned into a kind of outright hostility necessarily. But even the Palestinian Communist Party, because of its subservience to Moscow, maintained a kind of partition logic until today. I mean, after the Oslo agreements, they renamed themselves the Palestinian People's Party and turned themselves from a resistance faction into a political party, as if the Oslo gave us a state and they were going to participate in some regular parliamentary activity. Just completely believe the lie somehow. Which is not to say that they didn't do very important things, right? The Palestinian Communist Party was a crucial part of enabling resistance within Palestine before 1994, especially in a place in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, and especially with agricultural workers. So just you have to kind of maintain an understanding of what people did and what they didn't do and stuff like this. Again, Arab states, their biggest fear, and like any dictatorship, like any police state, and we should just remember, other than maybe South Yemen for a particular moment of time, Arab regimes' biggest fear is their own people. Their biggest enemy is their own people. They've never failed to show us this, right? Arab militaries only exist and police forces only exist to repress their own population. These militaries do not really partake in anything else, for the most part. I mean, have we seen any Arab military participate in any way to hinder, let alone stop, this genocide? Not one bullet. Right? If there was a couple of bullets fired in Jordan, it was by people who were then very severely punished for it. So the parallels are very much there, right? And that we have a global order, whether it's a Cold War order or the U.S. unipolar order, or even into whatever this world is turning into now, a global order where the superpowers see themselves as thoroughly enmeshed in Israel and Israel's interests as their own interests, and will gear their power and influence over Arab regimes for those ends, and will actively work to undermine any kind of Palestinian resistance activity by prescribing and legally classifying as terrorist any one of these organizations, to the point where not only can you not support them publicly or financially or materially, you place yourself at risk to even voice support in a conversation like this one, to wear a t-shirt, right? As we're seeing with even organizations that never caused any bodily harm, but were causing harm to things like weapons factories and drones and missiles. And so there's a complete, this silencing of that kind of, Kanafani was expelled from his university in Damascus, which was supposed to be an on-side kind of regime, right? So, but anybody who's been involved in Palestine activism in the Arab world can tell you this, right? Has faced consequences over this. There's a line you can't touch. And that line is the legitimacy of Arab dictatorships and Arab police states, which is all Arab states are dictatorships and police states, without exception. And again, other than maybe a moment of South Yemen, the only kind of actual socialist experiment in the Arab world, there's no moment where we've had an Arab regime that was not a military regime and a police state. To create a Palestine movement in any of these contexts is something that is terrifying to these regimes, and always has been, because if we start talking about freedom, because Palestine is freedom, right? To talk about Palestine, to talk about support for the Palestinian revolution, to talk about support for the Palestinian resistance, is to talk about freedom. And in the context of a police state and a military dictatorship, freedom is the scariest word in the dictionary. That's the word that you wish you can scratch out. And any word that is a dog whistle for freedom, like the letter Z in the Greek military junta era, that becomes also something that is anathema. That is something that needs to be criminalized and needs to be squashed and silenced.
Let's talk about freedom then. Like, if we say that Kanafani is not a nationalist in that regard, right?
Well, he is a pan-Arabist,
right? But
he's not a national chauvinist, for sure.
Not national chauvinist, right? And so what does freedom mean then for Kanafani if statehood is not the goal, essentially?
I think... where are we going to draw on for this? That freedom for Kanafani is, let's remember that this is a communist, right? So freedom is freedom from class oppression, it's freedom from gender oppression, it's freedom from imperial and colonial oppression, and it's freedom from the repression of the state. It's the freedom from a police state. So we have all of those freedom froms. But then we also have the freedom to think and to express and to love. Kanafani is all about love and beauty at the end, right? I mean, this is a poet at heart. So he's and I mean, freedom to dissent. This is an aspect of Kanafani that I think if we were to try to kind of write him as some doctrinaire person, we entirely miss the mark. And I think there's people out there who really want to make him the poster boy for Marxism-Leninism, or the poster boy for kind of almost like a chauvinistic Arab nationalism. He's none of those things. He's a very independent thinker, to the point where if you go through the issues of Al-Hadaf, you will find moments where on the very first page, Al-Hadaf is the magazine that he was the senior editor of for the PFLP, where the PFLP leadership has put in a little disclaimer saying that article that Kanafani wrote in that last issue, that was just his opinion. That wasn't the official line of the PFLP. But then the fact that he also wrote under over a dozen pen names, right? He knew that whatever he said or wrote would be something that would be considered, oh, is that the PFLP's position? You know, there's consequences to that. And so he has over a dozen pen names that he's writing under where he can voice his own opinions, right? And so, you know, I imagine that he understands that consequences are there for a reason. The PFLP needs to maintain lukewarm relations with places so that it can have an office and an above-ground existence and be able to raise money and funds and have places where people can train and study and whatnot. But he wants to voice those opinions nonetheless, right? And so I think it is a freedom to actualize ourselves as individuals and collectively. And I think that, you know, if we were to do a reading of all of his writing, looking for those pieces, we would find them all over the place, you know, that he's a deeply human, sensitive, tender poet who sees that, you know, that these regimes are clamping down on our ability to be us as individuals and as collectivities, and that's primarily why they need to be fought against and resisted and done away with, and that there is no future of freedom with these kinds of regimes in place.
So, like, when you think about statehood, for example, India was one of the first countries to recognize Palestine, right, as a state. It was sort of like the first non-Arab country to recognize the PLO as representatives, you know, the real representatives of the Palestinian people. So they are these markers, right? And statehood is one of the highest marker of like supporting Palestine.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Right? And so how do we get the public, you know, the global public to understand, to move beyond the idea of a state?
It's going to take a lot of public education and work, I think. You know, in many ways, statehood is the prime manifestation of global imperialism. It's just been so naturalized and normalized that it's almost impossible for people to think beyond it, to think past it, to even recognize that it's it has such a deleterious, such a kind of devastating effect on human society, because state is border, state is prison, state is police force, state is military. State is space of accumulation for national ruling classes, where they kind of control a body of law so they can control a population, so they can control an accumulation regimes that enables things like billionaires, one of the most unethical things humanity has produced, right? The notion that somebody can be so wealthy while the vast majority of the world's population are struggling to figure out where the next meal is going to come from. And so, but in the case of Palestinian statehood, it's particularly egregious, right? It's almost like, you know, you can understand someone talking about a Palestinian nation state as at least a step away from living under a genocidal apartheid regime, towards a moment where there's at least the space to have the luxury of struggling against statehood from a position of a kind of like a liberal version of freedom, which is the freedom from, right? Where you can be just a good neoliberal subject, have a job, save up, you know, and so on. But Palestinian statehood is particularly egregious because Palestinian statehood is apartheid. Right? Palestinian statehood, as it has been described and as it exists, or the trajectory towards Palestinian statehood that has been in the works since the 1970s that Kanafani was warning against, is apartheid statehood. It's the Bantustan, right? It's a way of normalizing a Palestinian police state that acts as the first line of defense for the genocidal regime that we call Israel. Right? It's the complete betrayal of Palestinian refugees, And let's remember that 70% plus of Palestinians are refugees. 7 out of every 10 Palestinians you can meet are refugees. 9 out of every 10 Palestinians you can meet are displaced people, now because of Gaza, because of what the Israelis have done in Gaza. And a complete betrayal of all of those Palestinians within 48 occupied Palestine, right? Those Palestinians who were forced to hold Israeli citizenship. What is their place in Palestinian statehood? Completely turns our backs on them, right? And that Palestinian statehood is, as Kanafani describes it in The Spectre of the Palestinian State, the Palestinian statehood is the ultimate embodiment of Palestinian subservience and Palestinian, effectively like the boot on the Palestinian neck is Palestinian statehood. There's 2 things that also need to be said about Palestinian statehood. One is that Israeli politics is generally characterized as having a left and a right wing, a kind of like Labour, Mapai, Ben-Gurion's legacy wing, and the right wing, which is Netanyahu and whatnot. Of course, the Israeli left is the apartheid right wing. So Israeli politics is really about having a far right wing and a fascist genocidal right wing, and it's all genocidal at this point. The Israeli establishment, which is Ben-Gurion's legacy, and who have controlled Israeli politics for most of the time that Israel has been in existence, which is from 1948 to the late 70s, and again from the 80s to Netanyahu's win, with the kind of Ariel Sharon in between. That Labor, let's call it the Labor Party, their version of how to secure the long-term existence of the State of Israel was Palestinian statehood, right? Was create this apartheid situation where there's a Palestinian Bantustan. If you're going to be Palestinian, it needs to be inside the open-air prison of the Bantustan. We shut them away, and then we normalize relations with everybody else, and the world can forget about the Palestinians who we've tucked away into their little ghettos, and we get to flourish and play regional power, if not global power. The Israeli far-right fascist genocidal right wing, which are the heirs of a guy called Vladimir Jabotinsky and a wing of Zionism that gets called revisionist Zionism, they've been explicitly genocidal from the beginning, right? So Jabotinsky's teachings to his followers, who become the first Likud Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, and who become Netanyahu, and who become Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and what's called the Temple Movement, all of that, which is basically the Zionism of Trump, right, in terms of who Trump talks to as his main Zionist influences and so on. So basically the version of Zionism we now have that has been really kind of on the ascendant for the past few decades and is in power for the past decade or so. That version of Zionism is against the apartheid wall, right? That's the version of Zionism that says the most important places for us are Nablus and Bethlehem and Al-Khalil Hebron. That's the kingdom of Judea and Samaria. That's the part that we came here for. And so when we build a wall, we're placing a limit to our own expansion. Our goal is for all of these Palestinians in Nablus to be gone. Our goal is for all of these Palestinians who are in Gaza to be gone. Why are we placing limits on our own expansion? And so, in a way, there's this very kind of grotesque and macabre side to Palestinian statehood, which is that ghetto at least preserves a Palestinian presence in the open-air prison of Nablus and in the open-air prison of Gaza and in the open-air prison of Bethlehem. Right? And so in a way, there's this almost kind of like left-seeming, because it's being compared to complete genocide, the complete eradication of Palestinian presence in Palestine, which is the ultimate goal of Zionism. Yeah. From day one, they were explicit about it then, they're explicit about it now. It's just a certain variants of Zionism have tried to kind of give themselves a liberal face. Labor Zionism, Ben-Gurion's legacy, tried to give a liberal face to Zionism, right? Which is that we don't talk about the Nakba, we blame the Arabs for the Nakba. We don't actually say that, no, actually we systematically destroyed over 500 villages to displace as many Palestinians as we could, as possible, right? And And our biggest mistake was that we didn't finish the job. That's Benny Morris, the main Israeli historian of the Nakba. His position is, I studied how we systematically displaced the majority of Palestinians from Palestine, but our biggest mistake was we didn't finish the job. Ben Gurion didn't finish the job, right? That's the left-wing position. And it's that, those who remain, we cage them in, we call the cage a state, like I said earlier. And so in a way, kind of this like support for Palestinian statehood is a way of dog whistling a kind of support for something that's not the full genocidal right. So in a way, it becomes a progressive position if you're only comparing it to full-scale, 100% elimination of Palestinians from the face of the earth, right? So that's one thing that's kind of like important to think about in terms of statehood. The other is that because it's the genocidal fascist right that has been in power, right? Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir, they are kind of frantically against anybody talking about Palestinian statehood, because that statehood would place a limit. It would be a return to the ghetto politics, right? Because since Oslo, the way that this game has been played is that the Israelis will say, okay, we're in a peace process. The Palestinians are misbehaving. We're going to set up 100 new settlements. We're going to expropriate 100 new acres of land. We're going to imprison another 1,000 people. But it's this kind of like tit for tat of like, this checkpoint moves here. The route of the wall is going to pass through here. There's popular protests. This kind of nickel and dime over where is the boundary of the ghetto, and this prison warden called the Palestinian Authority, what are its powers and what kinds of privileges does it get? And we kind of nickel and dime with that. Whereas Netanyahu's line is always just like, we don't want you here. There is a Palestinian state, it's called Jordan, until we finish you off, and then go and finish off Jordan as well and expand into it, right? That's very much the kind of revisionist Zionist. They're very, very clear about it. And so just to kind of have this caveat that like when Indira Gandhi recognizes the PLO as a sole legitimate representative and adopts a position that we are in support of Palestinian statehood, it's not coming from a place of Zionism per se, right? It's coming from a place where, how am I, as a progressive regime in India, not that Indira Gandhi is all progressive, right? But just as a regime that wants to show solidarity with Palestine, am I supposed to be more in solidarity with Palestinians than their official representatives who are embodying them in the PLO? Can I be more radical than Arafat on Palestine when Arafat is formally the person who is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people? This is part of the catastrophe of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, is that our people and our struggle has been consistently represented by a leadership that is far more reactionary than the people, right? This again takes us back to Ghassan Kanafani and Saad, of like, no, the compass is the people. The compass is the people in the refugee camps and in the villages and in the crafts shops and whatnot, right? It's the teachers and the farmers and so on. They're at the front lines of this. They don't need to read a book about the history of Palestine. Their family is the history of Palestine. And again, 70% of us are refugees. So for 70% of us, for the majority of us, Palestine as a struggle is a struggle to return. What does it say that our liberation organization's official line since the 70s has been that we're willing to turn our backs on the refugees and the struggle for return? Our liberation movement is a movement for return of refugees. That's the fundamental pillar. The PLO was I was kind of shocked to see it myself. So you can go online and find the video of the formal establishment of the PLO. The PLO was formally established in 1964 in East Jerusalem, which was Jordanian controlled, with King Hussein sitting in the front row. King Hussein was the king of Jordan at the time, the current king's grandfather. The person who was selected to be the first chairman of the PLO was a Palestinian who was Saudi Arabia's representative to the United Nations, a guy called Ahmed al-Shuqairi. And al-Shuqairi gets up and gives his formal speech declaring the establishment of the PLO, and goes at lengths to make sure that he's delivering the message across about what Palestine is geographically. And he doesn't include the West Bank because that's under Jordanian control. He can't say that the West Bank is part of Palestine when the West Bank is part of Jordan formally, as far as the Jordanian regime is concerned. So he's really talking about Gaza and 48 Palestine as the borders of Palestine. The PLO is a refugee movement, right? It's a movement that is talking about Palestine as that space from which the refugees were expelled, and the space with the highest density of those expelled, which is the Gaza Strip, right? Which Egypt never considered part of Egypt formally, always considered it part of a future Palestine, and part of a Palestinian space that it treated as a security concern and occupied militarily and with all of those kind of caveats. But the PLO formally was really only interested in the liberation of 48 Palestine. The Palestinian revolution is a refugee revolution. When we talk about Kanafani, we're not talking about somebody who's sitting in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. And if he was, he'd be sitting in a refugee camp because he's from Akka. He was displaced from Jaffa, right? These are spaces that were taken by the Israelis by force, forcibly displaced most of their populations in 1948. And we can never forget that because that's fundamentally what this is about for us, right? Is the dissolution of these borders, the end of imperial control of our region, the end of dictatorships and police states and military states. But fundamentally, it's about return to our land. The people of the land who were displaced from that, forcibly displaced from that land and not forcibly not allowed to return to it, to it, right? So just to keep in mind that like there's this added level to statehood, which is that even though statehood is part of a Zionist imperialist strategy, which the Arab regimes have fully adopted since 1974 and backed, of creating something that will contain Palestinian anger and Palestinian revolutionary activity because it threatens to be contagious and has been contagious to people in the rest of the Arab world and to the rest of the globe, as we see now. And so to contain it, so it's extremely reactionary. But then when you juxtapose it to mass annihilation and eradication of the Palestinian people, it can take on these progressive overtones, right? So just kind of to have that in mind as we speak about state.
No, for sure. And it makes me think about, whether you are also suggesting that the Palestinian leadership is a stumbling block for countries around the world who want to stand with the Palestinian people, but have to sort of like, play politics with the Palestinian leadership. So basically thinking about a country like India, which is so duplicitous during the late 60s and early 70s, in which, Indira Gandhi, becomes so close to Yasser Arafat, and at the same time setting up direct ties between Mossad and the intelligence agency in India from her office. Or thinking about South Africa today, pushing this ICJ case, right, to at the same time, sending coal to Israel. Sure. And you just wonder,
not to mention the diamond industry.
And the diamond industry, of course. And you just wonder, like, to what extent is this sort of stumbling block being created by the Palestinian leadership, or is it just the entire, international order that's just completely warped?
It's both. It's definitely both, right? So on some level, if you have a regime like the early decades of Castro's Cuba, if the Palestinian position is, liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea and the return of the refugees, they're not going to have any issues supporting that. That's what they're there to support, But then, I don't know if Indira Gandhi would have supported it in the same way. If this wasn't the reformed Arafat of the 1974 Palestinian National Congress, we will accept Palestine on any inch of land that we get to plant the flag on, that's then supported by the League of Arab States with all of the kind of potential oil contracts and all of the potential kind of non-aligned movement alliances and friendships and whatnot, and that has an international recognition as an observer state at the United Nations, which also the tit for tat with that partially translates into the Zionism is racism resolution, also from the mid-1970s, right? A UN General Assembly that is much more ready to take a position about Zionism and the state of Israel, right, than what we have now. that's all built into that. But then also like this thing about kind of just like Israel really playing a linchpin type role in the global capitalist regime. Right? I mean, if you're a diamond exporter, you don't get to play that game without having relations with Israel. If you want to talk about biometric technology and about military technology, you do this without kind of tying yourself to the Israeli military-industrial complex at your own risk, right? Unless you're China or something that's big enough to kind of go this alone. Also, if you want to have any relations with the United States. The United States has very systematically conditioned relations with it, trade relations with it, especially for the regimes in the region, on economic ties with Israel, right? And so this game has been rigged in multiple ways, and also, to be an enemy of the Mossad rather than somebody who's working with the Mossad is also something that comes with its perils, right? For Gandhi and for others. But then also the fact that, there's an affinity there. There's an affinity between Arafat and Indira Gandhi, right? This is about elitist regimes that are not really democracies, that are formalistic democracies. The PLO is a very formalistic democracy, but actually way more democratic than most formalistic democracies, because a Palestinian had kind of representatives in the PLO, not just through their political faction, but also through their unions. Like those had their own seats in the Palestine National Council. And the unions aren't like the unions of the different work sectors. There's a general union of Palestinian workers. There's also a general union of Palestinian women, of students, of the disabled, of writers and journalists. And so you can be many of those things, right? And have your interests and your needs and your demands, in theory, in formal theory, reach the highest level of power, which is the kind of parliamentary body of the Palestine National Council. You can advocate for yourself through all of those different ways, in theory. And in practice, in some cases, by the way, right? This isn't me just kind of poo-pooing that. It did function as something where people felt close to the levers of power until Arafat really kind of devastated that. In 1974, when the Palestine National Council passes the resolution that says we'll accept a Palestine on any centimeter of land, basically opening the door to a diplomatic negotiated settlement. But this wasn't just like treason for the sake of treason. This was based on a change of strategy. It was based on the idea that armed struggle is not going to do anything. It was based on the short-termism of we need to see results now. And so therefore, what is the only thing that might be realistic and pragmatic? Because they effectively start to label themselves as the ideology of pragmatism. That's Fatah's calling card, is pragmatism. So what is this pragmatism? Is that we're going to convince the United States that we are we can be a partner for peace, as in we will take international dictates and implement them and be that first line of defense for anybody who needs us to be a first line of defense, definitely for the Arab regimes, who are our main funders. And in return for the U.S. then placing pressure on Israel to cede some ground. Right? This becomes from 1974, the strategy for the liberation of Palestine that is formulated and carried out by the right wing of the Palestinian leadership is that we will convince the United States to liberate Palestine for us. The most mind-boggling. Again, we have the hindsight advantage, but we also have an understanding that Kanafani is giving us about what it means to be the reactionary leadership of Palestine, is that you're willing to beg for the scraps off the table so long as you get to be the king of the scrapyard.
Yeah.
Right? And to have the VIP lounge and to have people bow to you and call you sir.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like, as he says, negotiating with a sword at your neck, essentially, right?
True.
And I think that's a nice segue to think about Palestinian representation, right? Talking about that exact video, where he's asked about why don't you speak, why don't you talk?
Yeah.
And he replies, talk about what? To talk to whom, right? And the journalist doesn't seem to understand the power imbalance, or refuses to understand the power imbalance, or he also wants Palestinians to give up, right? when we think about Ghassan Kanafani's book on Zionist literature, right, about this whole ecosystem of Zionist cultural production, right, is this, what we saw then in terms of what he was asked and in terms of how the Western mainstream media covers Palestine today? Is this just the machine doing its thing?
So in on Zionist literature, Kanafani, it's a really, really important text, and I really, really recommend for people who haven't read it, especially who have an interest in the relationship between culture and politics, culture and revolution, culture and oppression, to read that text, because it's really one of the most important radical texts on the relationship between culture and power. Because he begins by kind of like analyzing the types of tropes, the types of themes that will exist in literature that enables him to then talk about something called a literary Zionism. So Zionism in culture. But then the more important kind of section of that is, unlike people who study ideology, who really just want to be like, oh, he used the word civilized, he used the word barbaric, he used the word savage, kind of students of Orientalism who treat kind of discourse analysis as something that you do by just like looking for particular words or for what is left unsaid and this kind of thing, which, can be valuable. But what's much more interesting and much more of relevance to power is the institutional arrangements, is the material side of this. Who is publishing the book? Follow the money, follow the power, follow the capital, right? And so it's about what Bertolt Brecht called the apparatus of cultural production, which is not just who owns the theater and who owns the marketing company that's selling the tickets and who is the impresario. It's also who is the press that's publishing the review, who is the awards, who's behind the awards that are telling you what is the best play of the year, who is behind because when you walk into a bookstore, there's 1,000 books to choose from. I mean, on one wall. How do you choose the book that you end up choosing? Sometimes it's the cover, sometimes the title, but most often it's something like recognition of the name of the author, and it's this won the XYZ award on this year, right? It's things like awards. It's that you read a review, you read something that recommended it, you read a blurb that's written by someone that you respect. That's, and kind of tracing those lines, you begin to see what that apparatus is. Because you're effectively, most of the time, told what to read. It doesn't just come to you, right? Especially given just how many books are out there. And this is just on the level of books. But on Zionist literature is about books. So he's looking at something like, why in 1966 did the Nobel Prize for Literature go to like a really seventh-rate Israeli novelist? And this guy won a Nobel Prize. Nobody knows who he is. I keep forgetting his name. I have no idea what his name is. You'd have to look it up. Why is it that like Exodus, the book Exodus, which is then turned into a movie, is kind of like the most formative object of cultural production that informs Western minds on Israel-Palestine, on the politics of Palestine in the wake of the Nakba? Right? The fact that it's pushed as the book that's going to help you understand, the film that will help you understand what this is all about. And so Zionism comes out as this liberation movement, the thing that protects the Jews after the Holocaust, our place under the sun, as Netanyahu called his autobiography. And so that's where this text is extremely kind of crucial.
We have seen a lot of emphasis in the West, right? Be it in the UK or the US, when it comes to calling on Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims to sort of join the electoral system or be part of it somehow. This idea that you can change or reform the system within. We're seeing things like, or groupings like the Squad, or more recently Zohran Mamdani coming up and speaking about Palestine, but then also sort of beginning to prioritize domestic issues like affordability and sort of sacrificing or softening the language on Palestine. Does Kanafani's writing help us understand this sort of phenomenon at all?
Yeah, I mean, well, I haven't seen specific writing by Kanafani on electoral systems, which is not to say it doesn't exist, because Kanafani's writing, again, it exists under many pen names. And really, the treasure trove of his writings is what shows up in the periodicals. And most of that has not been collected and republished. You actually physically have to go back through every issue of a revolutionary magazine because he didn't also just write in the magazines he was editor for. He wrote everywhere. And add the pen names to that, you really are kind of covering the spectrum of progressive publishing in Arabic. My sense from his general politics is that, these states are bourgeois states. And so the electoral system is really kind of a committee to manage the affairs of the bourgeoisie, right? Which I think is a line from the Communist Manifesto. Reformism is not really going to, it's really just a way of consolidating those regimes rather than a way of dismantling them. However, I think, and here I'm veering away from Kanafani and just kind of, it's a conversation I've been a part of for a while. I think that because the elections are made to carry so much weight as faithful, there's a hyperfixation on electoral moments, on elections, for instance. There's a moment where you have a large part of the population quite primed to pay attention to politics in a way that they might not be in other moments. And so electoral moments are moments where real issues can surface in ways that get people talking about them. It's not that the candidate winning is the thing that's going to get you something as a movement for change. But it is a moment where, people will listen when Mamdani is going to speak for now. There was a moment where the squad were listened to. That moment is kind of over. Bernie Sanders raised issues about the U.S. political class that had not really been given that much airtime. But then at the same time, you see the media shut ranks. The media covered a lot more Trump than they did Bernie Sanders, right? The media is going to cover a lot more of Zohran Mamdani's contenders than Mamdani himself, especially insofar as Palestine is concerned, unless it's something that can then be taken to say he's an anti-Semite. We need to hate him, don't vote for him. Corbyn's program was not exactly deeply covered by the media, but then the invented thing about Corbyn's anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism in the the invention of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, at least the blowing it up to the point where even the Jewish members of the Labour Party were also smeared and then purged, expelled from the party on the basis of being anti-Semites. That was given immense coverage, right? And so I think attentiveness to the apparatus of cultural production that we spoke about with On Zionist Literature, right? The fact that the power of something like the BBC or the Times or the New York Times or whatnot is that it's somehow the objective place where you're going to get news and information. But then if that's as skewed as we now see it to be, then millions of people are experiencing information that they consider objective and unbiased, whatever that means, that is completely a political agenda, right? And it's a political agenda to whitewash genocide, to call it something that's not genocide, and it becomes this, that's quite unfortunate thing that's happening over there. I wish the war would stop, is really what we're... And insofar as there may be a critique of any kind of Zionist activity, it's personalized in Netanyahu. And so it's like Netanyahu is the problem, not Zionism from its very inception as political Zionism, as a movement to create an exclusively Jewish state, ethno-state in Palestine, was a white supremacist, genocidal ideology. And once put it in practice, is 78 years of genocide that has intensified and in fits and starts over time. And the last 2 years are the most violent intensification of that genocide that we've ever witnessed, because it's become about mass murder, not just about mass forced displacement. From 1947 to 2023, Zionism's genocidal tendencies were really enacted as a system of land theft and forced displacement, right? Creating a mass displaced population. Since 2023, it has turned into a genocide of mass slaughter, right? It's about killing the largest number, not just displacing the largest number. But it is. But from the 1880s and 1890s, it was about transforming the space of what would become the Jewish state into an exclusively Jewish state. That has been a constant. That's not really changed, right? To the point where we can see even that, like, Israel will tout itself as, this very kind of humanitarian country that takes in refugees, but then we don't really get the part of the story where all of the African refugees who they'll show on the news as being accepted and allowed in are then just deported, right? Non-Jewish African refugees.
I just want to return to that clip, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
The one about the neck talking to the sword. Are there many clips of Ghassan Kanafani speaking? And I know that clip rotates quite a lot, right, on YouTube.
No, there aren't. There's somebody interviewed him for a Lebanese filmmaker, interviewed him for a film, and that footage has recently kind of been brought out of the cupboard. But we don't have a lot of video of Kanafani.
Yeah. But how representative are those clips that we were talking about, like, with regards to the way he wrote, or the kind of style, the swagger that he carried? It's
representative in terms of the swagger and style, I suppose. But remember, Kanafani's not. I mean, he was never. Other than those clips, basically, he wasn't gearing his writing for a white Western audience. That wasn't his primary concern, right? When we think about, in this moment of deep crisis, he's writing a text about understanding the reactionary Palestinian and Arab leadership. That in the moments where the revolutionary movement is growing in the 1960s, he's writing analyses of Palestinian resistance literature and of Zionist literature and the apparatus of cultural production. That his short stories are kind of slice of life, him coming to terms with what it means to be a Palestinian refugee. When we think about the magazines and periodicals that he was editor for and wrote immense amount, basically the bulk of his writing for, were really debates about how do we improve as a revolutionary and liberation movement. These are all internal conversations. Now, internal for him doesn't mean just Palestinians. Internal for him is primarily an Arab community, an Arabic reading and writing community, which doesn't have to be kind of ethnically Arab, but people who see themselves as part of that space that gets coded Arab, right? So kind of from Morocco to Iraq, plus the broader kind of dispersal and diaspora of that. But then a close second place being the communities of the global south that are fighting colonialism and imperialism. That's his people, right? And when we say global south also, it's not just a geographical marker, because definitely a black or indigenous North American fits into that category for him. Definitely a migrant facing racism in Europe fits into that category, right? So these are not geographical markers. This is, are you from a community of struggle against bourgeois, capitalist, and imperialist power? Or are you someone who is normalizing and perpetuating and strengthening and entrenching that power? Though that's the polarity. And this is about the fight for those who are on the receiving end of power, to think about how we are to organize ourselves, to fight that power and to win. Right? And so, again, he's not a propagandist. He's not here to be the spin doctor for the revolution. Now, if you ask him a question like, why aren't you negotiating with those who are saying they want to eliminate your presence, and actually you physically, as Ghassan Kanafani, are a refugee whose presence was eliminated because you were forcibly displaced. Why aren't you going and chit-chatting over tea with the person who did that to you? He's going to give you an answer, right? And he's eloquent, sharp as a sword, hilarious, witty, and very clear on who he is and where he is. And if an Arab asked him that same question behind closed doors, they would have gotten the same answer, right? So this was not some line. This was not some spin doctoring. This was not the kind of spokesperson performance. He was placed in that position because he was in a spokesperson role, and this white English-speaking journalist came to his office and asked him those questions. But I mean, the clarity is the same, the position is the same, and it's just that like an Arab would have had a lot more shame to ask such a stupid question of like, why aren't you having chit chat with the guy whose boot is on your face, right? Why isn't the neck asking to have a conversation with the sword that's about to pierce through it? Yeah.
Who are Kanafani's heirs?
Kanafani's heirs are all of those people who are grappling with the question, how do we get free? And doing it in all seriousness, right? Not to get accolades, not to get published, not to get tenure, not to for people to give them applause, but because they see an urgency and necessity of the gravity of the need to get free, because all of the situations and conditions that Kanafani lived under, we are living under, but much more intensely, right? We are talking about a situation where our very planet is at stake, right? It's not just about a particular set of populations who happen to be a majority of populations, right, who faced imperialism and colonialism. But global capitalism is at a point that's far more advanced than it was when Kanafani was living and writing. So the urgency is much, much more real. So all of those people who are engaging with the question of how do we get free are the heirs of Ghassan Kanafani. I don't think this is about some kind of celebrity list or some superstar list. But the question becomes like, who is doing it as effectively and with as much insightfulness, incisiveness, sharpness, and engagement and deep engagement? And I don't think it's a small number of people. But I do think that the mode of engagement, a lot of it has turned to things like social media, So it may be that the Kanafanis of today are making reels, not just writing articles or editing books. They may be running accounts. But there are also those people who are thinking and reading and writing, right? And I'm sure that even on Middle East Eye, if we kind of like go through and look for people who are genuinely speaking about liberation, right? Not performatively, but about like thinking about what are the forces that is the constellation against us? Who is we? What are we doing? How are we doing it? And how can we do it better? And what is freedom to us? Those are the heirs of Ghassan Kanafani. We should all be the heirs of Ghassan Kanafani. And not because it's Kanafani, because he wasn't also the only exceptional, right? There are, whether Palestinian or Arab or Global South or Black or Indigenous globally, he is one of many who are part of a tradition of people who are taking the urgency and seriousness of the devastation wrought by capitalism, imperialism, patriarchy, and so on against the people and life on earth, life, beauty, love. These are the victims of those powers. So in that sense, there are thousands of heirs of Ghassan Kanafani.
And I guess that's a good way of ending this conversation. Thank you so much, Hazem, for speaking with us.
It's my pleasure.